Hello everyone and welcome back to Shadow Man Stories. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now, let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Michael Frostborn, and I've been a park ranger in Alaska for 17 years. People always ask about the name. Yeah, it's real. My grandmother was Inupiat, my grandfather Norwegian. They met during the gold rush days, and somehow that combination made me perfect for this job. At least, that's what I used to think. I work out of Denali National Park, way up in the Kantishna wilderness. Most folks never see where I patrol. It's just me, the ice, and whatever's brave enough or stupid enough to live out here. After nearly 2 decades, I figured I'd seen everything Alaska could throw at me. Grizzlies, wolves, tourists who thought flip-flops were good hiking gear. I handled it all. But January 1983 was different. We were deep into polar night, that time when the sun doesn't show its face for months. The temperature had been sitting at 40 below for 3 weeks straight. Even for Alaska, that was brutal. The kind of cold that turns your breath into ice crystals before it leaves your mouth. The kind that kills you in minutes if you're not careful. I was stationed at the Kantishna cabin, 80 miles from the nearest settlement. No phone lines out here, just a radio that worked when it felt like it. The Aurora was acting up something fierce that winter, playing hell with all our electronics. Some nights, the green lights dancing across the sky were so bright you could read by them. My grandmother used to tell me stories about the Aurora. She called it the spirits dancing. "They're not all friendly, little wolf," she'd say in her mix of English and Inupiat. "Some dance to call the ice walkers. When the lights are too bright, you stay inside. You show respect." I hadn't thought about those stories in years. Funny how the mind works, digs up old memories when you need them most. The call came in on January 15th. Dr. Sarah Chen and her research team had been studying permafrost changes up near the Muldrow Glacier. They'd been out there 6 days, checking ice core samples and measuring temperature changes. Standard stuff. Sarah was solid. She'd been coming up here for 5 years, knew the rules, never took stupid risks. Then their emergency beacon went off. When I got the alert, I tried raising them on the radio. Nothing. Just static and something that sounded almost like whispering, but that had to be interference from the Aurora. I grabbed my gear and headed out on the snowmobile. Standard rescue protocol: food, shelter, medical supplies, and enough fuel for a 3-day round trip. The ride out took 4 hours through terrain that would make a mountain goat nervous. Ice fields stretched in every direction, broken by sharp ridges and hidden crevasses that could swallow a man whole. The Aurora was going crazy overhead, sheets of green and blue light rippling like water. Beautiful and terrifying at the same time. I'd done this run dozens of times, but something felt wrong that night. The usual landmarks looked different. Distances seemed off. Even my GPS kept showing readings that didn't match what I was seeing. I chalked it up to the Aurora messing with the satellites. When I reached their camp, my blood went cold. The research station was a mess. 3 tents scattered across the ice like toys thrown by an angry kid. Equipment everywhere: laptops, ice core samples, scientific instruments, all tossed around but not by wind. No snow had drifted against anything. In weather like this, anything left out for 6 days should have been buried. But there were no tracks, nothing human, nothing animal. Just smooth snow around the campsite, like the chaos had happened and then everything else had just stopped. I found Sarah's notebook, half buried under a sleeping bag. Her handwriting was usually neat, but the last few entries were shaky, rushed. Asterisk. Day 4. Ice formations are wrong. Geometric patterns where there should be random cracks. Asterisk. Asterisk. Day 5. Tom says he saw someone walking on the glacier last night. Tall figure, impossibly tall, but who could survive out here? Asterisk. Asterisk. Day 6. The ice is warm. I put my hand on it, and it's warm. This isn't possible. Asterisk. The final entry was just 2 words, written so hard the pencil had torn through the paper. Asterisk. They're here. Asterisk. I keyed my radio. Base, this is Frostborn. Found the research camp. No signs of the team. Requesting backup and static cut me off. Then something that made my skin crawl. Voices in the white noise, speaking words I couldn't understand but somehow recognized. Old words, the kind my grandmother whispered when she thought I wasn't listening. I checked my gear. Compass was spinning like a carnival ride. GPS showed I was standing in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Even my watch had stopped, hands frozen at 11:47. That's when I found the first track. It was huge, maybe 20 inches long, shaped like a human foot but wrong. Too narrow, with toes that stretched out like fingers. The print was deep, pressed into ice so hard it was like concrete. But here's the thing that made my hands shake. It was warm. Steam rose from it like it had been made seconds ago. I followed the tracks, because what else could I do? They led away from camp in a straight line, heading toward a ridge of ice formations I'd never seen before. Towers and arches of blue ice, carved into shapes that hurt to look at. Geometric patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The tracks went right up to a wall of solid ice. And then they disappeared. Not around it, through it. I stood there, staring at that wall for I don't know how long, my headlamp beam showing nothing but smooth ice. No cracks, no holes, nothing that could explain where the tracks went. I reached out and touched the ice, expecting the bitter cold that should have frozen my glove to it instantly. It was warm. Not just warm, it pulsed like a heartbeat. I yanked my hand back and stumbled backward. The aurora overhead was so bright now, it cast shadows on the snow. And in those shadows, I saw something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the world. A figure, tall as a basketball player but thin as a fence post, standing maybe 50 yards away. It didn't move like a person. It glided across the snow without leaving tracks, without making sound. When it turned toward me, I saw eyes like frozen stars, white and cold and completely aware. I blinked, and it was gone. My radio crackled to life. A voice I didn't recognize, speaking through static. Michael. Michael Frostborn. Who is this? How do you know my name? Your grandmother, she told us. About you. The signal died. I was alone again with just the wind and the impossible warmth radiating from the ice wall. My hands were shaking, and not from the cold. I made camp right there. I wasn't leaving without Sarah's team, and I wasn't traveling in the dark with whatever was out there watching me. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard movement outside my shelter, footsteps in the snow, voices whispering in languages that sounded familiar but made no sense. When I looked out, there was nothing but empty ice fields under the dancing lights. Come dawn, or what passed for dawn in the polar night, I found more tracks. Dozens of them, circling my camp like wolves around a campfire. But these weren't wolf tracks. They were the same impossible human prints, only now there were different sizes. Some small as a child's, others massive, like giants had been walking around my tent all night. I followed the freshest trail, my snowshoes crunching on snow that sparkled with ice crystals. The tracks led to another formation I'd never seen before, a natural amphitheater carved from blue ice, with walls that rose 30 feet on all sides. At the center was something that made me stop breathing, a perfect circle of melted ice, steam rising from dark water. And floating in that water, face up and eyes wide open, was Dr. Tom Martinez from Sarah's team. I ran to the edge and called his name. He didn't respond, didn't even blink, just stared at the sky with pupils so dilated I could barely see any white. But he was breathing. Somehow, impossibly, he was breathing. The water should have been frozen solid in this temperature. Instead, it was warm enough that I could see my reflection in the surface. Tom's lips were moving, forming words without sound. I leaned closer to hear. They walk through ice, he whispered. They walk through ice like it's air. Tom, can you hear me? Where are the others? His eyes rolled toward me, but I don't think he was seeing me. The ice remembers, Michael. Your grandmother knew. She tried to warn us all. Before I could respond, the water began to churn. Something was rising from the depths, a shadow that grew larger and larger until I realized with horror that the pool was much deeper than it looked. Tom's body started sinking as something pushed up from below. I grabbed his arm and pulled, but it was like trying to lift a truck. Whatever had him was strong. Then I felt it, fingers wrapping around my wrist. Not Tom's fingers. These were too long, too cold, with joints in the wrong places. I looked down into the water and saw a face looking back. Beautiful and terrible, with skin like blue ice and eyes that held the memory of 1,000 winters. It smiled at me with too many teeth and spoke in my grandmother's voice. "Little wolf," it said, "you came home." I yanked my arm free and fell backward onto the ice. Tom disappeared beneath the surface without a splash, and the water went still again. Steam continued to rise, but now it carried whispers in the Inupiat language. I ran. Behind me, I heard laughter like breaking glass and the sound of ice cracking. When I looked back, the entire amphitheater was collapsing, walls folding inward like a flower closing. In seconds, there was nothing but flat snow where the formation had been. My radio buzzed. This time it was Sarah's voice. "Michael, we're in the deep places now. They showed us the cities under the ice. So beautiful, so cold. Sarah, where are you? I'm coming to get you. Don't come deeper," she said, her voice fading. "They're testing you, Michael. They remember your blood. They remember the compact." The signal cut to static, then to that whispering voice again. "Atata, grandfather's grandson. Come to the center. Come and remember." I knew that voice now. It was the same one that used to sing me lullabies in the old language, the one that told me stories about spirits and respect and the things that lived in the deepest cold. It was my grandmother's voice, calling from the ice. I followed the voice because I had no choice. The tracks led deeper into the ice fields, past formations that defied physics and landmarks that rearranged themselves when I wasn't looking. My GPS had given up entirely, and my compass spun so fast it was just a blur. The aurora overhead was so bright now it hurt to look at, sheets of green and blue that moved with purpose rather than random wind patterns. And in those lights, I could see them clearly for the first time. They were everywhere, tall figures moving across the ice like ships on water, their elongated forms graceful despite their impossible height. Some were 12 feet tall, others even bigger. Their skin was translucent blue-white, and I could see dark fluid moving through what might have been veins. They didn't walk so much as glide, and when they passed through ice formations, the ice simply parted around them like they were made of the same substance. I counted at least 20 of them, all moving in the same direction. Toward a massive structure that rose from the ice ahead of me, a palace or temple carved from a single glacier, with spires that reached up into the aurora itself. At its base was a circle of standing ice pillars, each one 20 feet tall and glowing with internal light. And in the center of that circle, I saw Sarah and the rest of her team. They were alive but changed. Their skin had taken on a bluish tint, and their movements were too fluid, too graceful. They turned toward me as I approached, and I saw that their eyes had become the same frozen white as the entities around them. "Michael," Sarah said, and her voice carried perfectly across the distance between us. "You came, we knew you would." The largest of the ice walkers, the one I thought of as their leader, stepped forward. When it spoke, I heard my grandmother's voice coming from its throat. "Little wolf," it said, "your Ata made a compact with us long ago. When the gold seekers came with their fire and noise, when they disrupted the old balances, he offered his bloodline as guarantee. One of his line would always be here to listen, to understand, to bridge the old ways and the new." I remembered then. Stories my grandmother told about her father, how he'd made peace with the spirits when other men brought only violence to the ice, how he'd promised that his family would always show proper respect to the old powers. The research team. I started. Disrupted sacred ice, the entity continued. Took core samples from the deep places, from ice that holds memories older than your civilization. They had to be taught, but you have the old blood. You can choose. It gestured toward Sarah and the others. Join them in the deep places, become guardians of the ice roads that run beneath your world. Or what? Return to your surface world. But know that every winter, when the aurora dances too bright and the cold bites too deep, we will be watching. Waiting for the day when your people forget the compact entirely. The ice around us began to shift and flow like water. I could see passages opening in the glacier behind them, tunnels that led down into blue-lit depths where cities of ice stretched beyond imagination. The team members were already walking toward those passages, their human forms becoming more fluid with each step. "Sarah," I called. She turned back one last time. "It's not death, Michael. It's transformation. We'll guard the old places, keep them safe from those who would exploit them. It's an honor." The leader leaned down until its star-white eyes were level with mine. Choose, grandson of the compact keeper. But choose knowing that some promises echo through generations. I thought of my grandmother's warnings, of the stories she'd made me memorize about respect and balance. I thought of all the scientists and developers and tourists who came to Alaska thinking they could take whatever they wanted from the ice. I'll keep the compact, I said. But they come with me. The entity studied me for a long moment, then it straightened up and spoke in its own voice like wind through ice caves, old as glaciers. Acceptable. But know this, keeper of the compact, the ice remembers everything. And we are always watching. I don't remember the journey back to the research camp. One moment, I was standing in that circle of ice pillars. The next, I was helping Sarah and her team into my emergency shelter. They were human again, mostly, though their eyes still held flecks of that frozen starlight, and they spoke sometimes in languages I'd never heard. The official report listed the incident as severe weather exposure with possible carbon monoxide poisoning from faulty heaters. The team spent 3 weeks in psychiatric observation, but their stories never changed. They all described the same impossible cities beneath the ice, the same graceful guardians who had shown them wonders beyond human understanding. I requested a transfer after that. Now I work as a cultural liaison between the Park Service and local tribal councils. I spend my time documenting traditional knowledge, recording warnings that most people think are just folklore. But I know better. Every winter, when the aurora burns too bright and the temperature drops below 40 degrees, I get reports. Hikers who see tall figures moving across distant glaciers, research teams whose equipment malfunctions near certain ice formations, planes whose instruments go haywire over the deepest parts of the wilderness. I investigate every one. Sometimes I find tracks, those impossible prints that lead into solid ice. Sometimes I find people who've been touched by something beyond our understanding, their eyes holding memories of blue cities and guardians older than civilization. And sometimes, on the coldest nights when the aurora dances across the sky like spirits celebrating, I hear my grandmother's voice on the wind. "Little wolf," she whispers. "Thank you for remembering. The ice walkers are still out there. They're still watching, still guarding their ancient territories from those who would exploit them without understanding." The compact holds, but it's a fragile thing. Every year, more people come to Alaska with machines and ambition, thinking they can take whatever they want from the wilderness. They're wrong. The ice remembers everything, and some memories are older than human civilization. If you ever find yourself in Alaska during the deep winter, when the aurora burns too bright and the cold bites too deep, remember this: show respect. Listen to the old warnings, and never, ever take anything from the ice without permission, because they're always watching, and the ice remembers everything. My name is Elena Nighthawk, and I've been a park ranger for 13 years. I've seen things in Alaska's wilderness that would make most people pack up and head back to civilization. But what happened to me in September of 1987 changed everything I thought I knew about the natural world. I work in gates of the Arctic National Park, up in the Brooks Range. It's wild country, the kind of place where you can walk for days without seeing another human being. Rolling tundra stretches as far as you can see, broken up by scattered lakes and rocky hills. This is where the caribou come through twice a year, following paths their ancestors have used for thousands of years. I'm Athabascan, on my mother's side. My grandmother used to tell me stories about the old days, about spirits that lived in the wilderness. She'd talk about Amarok, the giant wolf that hunted alone. Not like the pack wolves, she'd say, her weathered hands moving as she spoke. Amarok is different, older. When he walks, even the bears hide. I always figured these were just stories, old folklore, to explain things people didn't understand back then. I had a doctorate in wildlife biology. I knew how predators worked, how ecosystems balanced themselves. Science had answers for everything. The call came in on September 15th. Our pilot, Jake Morrison, had been doing his regular survey flight over the Koyukuk River Valley when he spotted something that made him radio in immediately. "Elena, you need to get out to Sector 7, Jake's voice crackled through the radio. "There's something wrong with the caribou herd." "Wrong how?" I asked, already reaching for my gear. "They're dead. All of them. The whole damn herd. I felt my stomach drop. A caribou die-off could mean disease, and disease could spread fast in the Arctic. How many are we talking about? I counted at least 200 from the air, maybe more. And Elena. They're arranged weird. Like something organized them. I loaded my ATV with everything I'd need for a wildlife mortality investigation. Sample containers, camera equipment, field testing kit, emergency supplies. The drive to Sector 7 took me 3 hours across rough tundra, bouncing over rocks and splashing through shallow streams. The smell hit me first. Death has its own scent in the wilderness, sharp, metallic, wrong. But this was different, stronger, like the air itself was sick. When I crested the hill and saw the caribou, I had to stop the ATV and just stare. Jake was right. They were arranged, not scattered like you'd expect from a normal die-off or predator attack. They lay in perfect circles, concentric rings spreading out from a central point. Their heads all pointed inward, toward the center. I'd never seen anything like it. I grabbed my camera and started taking pictures. Standard protocol called for detailed documentation before disturbing the scene. But as I walked among the bodies, I noticed something else. Strange. No scavenger activity. In normal circumstances, ravens would have found dead caribou within hours. Bears, wolves, foxes, something should have been feeding. Instead, the bodies lay untouched. Even stranger, I couldn't see any obvious cause of death. No wounds, no signs of disease. They just looked like they'd laid down and died. The silence bothered me too. The tundra is never completely quiet. There's always wind. Always some bird or insect making noise. But here, in the middle of this death circle, I could hear nothing but my own breathing and heartbeat. I collected tissue samples from several animals and made notes in my field journal. The weather was getting worse, early winter storms were moving in, and I had maybe 2 hours of decent light left. I'd have to come back tomorrow with a full investigation team. As I packed up my equipment, something made me look toward the rocky outcrop about half a mile away. For just a second, I thought I saw movement, something big and gray against the dark stones. I raised my binoculars, but whatever it was had vanished. Probably just a shadow, I told myself, or maybe one of the local wolves checking out the area. The drive back to the station took longer than expected. My headlights cut through gathering darkness, and twice I had to stop to navigate around bog areas that hadn't been there on my morning trip out. The tundra was changing as the ground started to freeze, creating new hazards. Back at the ranger station, I called in my initial report. Disease seemed like the most likely explanation, though the arrangement of the bodies bothered me. I'd seen wolves organize prey before, but never like this. And never an entire herd. I tried calling my supervisor in Fairbanks, but the satellite phone kept cutting out. September storms could knock out communications for days. I was on my own until the weather cleared. That night, I sat in my cabin, reviewing the photos I'd taken. The more I looked at them, the more wrong everything seemed. The circular pattern was too perfect, too deliberate, and in one photo, taken from higher ground, I could see something I'd missed in person: tracks. A single line of tracks leading away from the center of the circle, heading toward the rocky outcrop where I'd seen the movement. Even in the photo, I could tell they were massive, much larger than any wolf tracks I'd ever seen. Outside, the wind was picking up, but underneath the wind, I could swear I heard something else. A sound that made my grandmother's stories suddenly seem a lot less like folklore. A howl. Long, deep, and impossibly loud. Like it was coming from everywhere at once. I woke up at dawn to complete silence. The howling had stopped sometime during the night, but I'd barely slept. Every time I dozed off, I'd dream about those caribou arranged in their perfect circles. My radio crackled to life as I was making coffee. It was Sarah Chen from the research station at Toolik Lake, about 60 miles southeast of my location. "Elena, did you hear anything unusual last night?" Her voice sounded strained. "You mean the howling?" "Yeah, I heard it. Probably just wolves responding to the caribou situation." "That wasn't wolves, Elena. We've been monitoring pack frequencies for 3 years. This was different." Dave ran the sound through our analysis equipment. The frequency was all wrong. Too low, too big. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic morning. "What do you mean, too big?" The sound signature suggests something with a much larger vocal apparatus than any wolf we've recorded. And Elena, it lasted for over 20 minutes. Wolves don't howl for 20 minutes straight. After the radio call, I couldn't concentrate on anything. I tried to work on my monthly reports, but my eyes kept drifting to the photos from yesterday. Finally, I gave up and decided to go back to Sector 7. The weather was worse. Clouds hung low over the tundra, and a cold wind cut right through my jacket. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees overnight, and ice was forming along the edges of the streams. When I reached the site, I knew immediately that something had changed. The caribou were still there, still arranged in their circles, but now there were other tracks, lots of them. Wolf tracks, bear tracks, even some fox prints, all circling the outer edge of the death site but never crossing into the area where the caribou lay. It was like there was an invisible barrier keeping the scavengers out. I followed the large tracks I'd photographed yesterday. They led straight toward the rocky outcrop, but as I got closer, I realized they weren't heading to the rocks at all. They went around them, toward a section of tundra that looked exactly like every other section, except for the bones. They were scattered in a rough line, old and weathered white. Caribou bones, I thought at first, but when I got closer, I realized some of them were too big. Way too big. Femur bones, the size of baseball bats. Skull fragments that could have come from an animal the size of a horse. I was photographing the bone scatter when I heard the sound. Not howling this time, but something worse. Breathing. Deep, rhythmic breathing that seemed to come from the ground itself. I froze, camera halfway to my eye, and listened. The breathing continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. In the silence that followed, I became aware of my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. Something was watching me. I turned slowly, scanning the landscape. The tundra stretched away in all directions, broken only by small hills and the scattered rocks. Nothing moved. But the feeling of being observed didn't go away. Then I saw the prints, fresh tracks, so new that water was still seeping into the impressions. They started about 10 feet from where I stood and headed north, toward the migration route. But these weren't like any animal tracks I'd ever seen. They were wolf-shaped, but enormous. Each print was over a foot long and pressed deep into the half-frozen ground. The stride length was impossible, nearly 12 feet between prints. No wolf could move like that. Nothing could move like that. I followed the tracks for about a quarter mile before they simply vanished. Not faded away or became hard to see, vanished. 1 second, there was a clear print in soft soil. The next, there was nothing but undisturbed tundra. That's when I saw the wolf. It was standing on a hill, about 200 yards away, and at first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. It looked like a normal gray wolf, except for the size. Its shoulder came up to about where a moose's shoulder would be. Its head was massive, with intelligent yellow eyes that seemed to look right through me. We stared at each other for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Then the wolf tilted its head back and howled. The sound hit me like a physical force. It was the same howl I'd heard the night before, but much closer, much stronger. It went on, a sound like nothing I'd ever experienced. I felt it in my chest, in my bones, in parts of me I didn't know could feel sound. When the howling stopped, the wolf was gone. I stood there shaking, not just from cold. Everything I thought I knew about wildlife behavior, about what was possible in the natural world, had just been turned upside down. I made it back to my ATV, on unsteady legs, and drove back to the station faster than was safe. I needed to think. I needed to figure out what I'd really seen. That night, I called my grandmother. She lived in Fairbanks now, in a small apartment near the hospital, but she still knew more about the old ways than anyone I could think of. "Grandmother," I said when she answered, "tell me about Amarok again." There was a long pause. "Why do you ask, Elena?" I think I might have seen something. Out in the park." Another pause. Longer this time. "Describe what you saw." I told her about the caribou, the tracks, the wolf on the hill. When I finished, she was quiet for so long I thought the connection had been lost. "Grandmother? Amarok is not just a wolf, Elena. He is the spirit of hunting itself. When he walks, it means the balance is wrong. Something has disturbed the old agreements." "What kind of agreements?" "Between people and the land. Between the living and the spirit world. When men take too much, or go where they should not go, Amarok comes to remind them of their place. But I'm not taking anything, I'm protecting the wildlife. Are you? Her voice was gentle but serious. Or are you studying it? Putting radio collars on wolves, tracking their movements, deciding which animals live where? I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. That's my job. Yes, she said sadly, that is your job. But it may not be what the land needs. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the wind and thinking about what my grandmother had said. Outside, something large was moving around my cabin. I could hear heavy footsteps in the snow that had started falling, circling the building again and again. I didn't have the courage to look outside. The next morning, the tracks around my cabin were unmistakable. The same massive wolf prints, but now they formed a complete circle around the building. Whatever had been out there had been watching me all night. I radioed Sarah at Tulik Lake, but the connection was full of static. What I could make out wasn't good. Elena found 3 of our wolves. Radio collars destroyed. Something killed. The signal cut out completely after that. I tried calling other stations, other rangers, anyone who might be able to help. But the atmospheric conditions were wrong. Solar activity, maybe, or just bad weather. Either way, I was completely isolated. The smart thing would have been to pack up and head for Fairbanks until whatever was happening resolved itself. But I couldn't leave. This was my territory, my responsibility, and despite everything, I was a scientist. I needed to understand what was happening. I spent the morning going through every wildlife report I had on file, looking for similar incidents. What I found made my hands shake. Hudson Bay, 1,894. Entire caribou herd found dead in mysterious circumstances. Native guides refused to enter area, claimed giant wolf spirit active. Northwest Territories, 1,923. Mountie Patrol discovers systematic destruction of wildlife. Local Inuit report sightings of wolf larger than any earthly creature. Alaska Territory, 1,956. Wildlife biologist disappears after reporting impossible predator activity near Kobuk Valley. The pattern went back over a century. Every 20 to 30 years, somewhere in the Arctic, someone reported the same thing. Massive wolf sightings, organized animal deaths. Then silence. I was studying a map, trying to plot the locations of historical incidents, when I heard vehicles outside. Through my window, I saw Jake Morrison's plane on the frozen lake, and behind it, a snowmobile I didn't recognize. Jake came to the door with another man I'd never met. The stranger was native, maybe 60 years old, with the kind of weathered face that comes from a lifetime outdoors. "Elena, this is Thomas Koyukon," Jake said. "He's a tracker from Arctic Village. When I told him what we found yesterday, he insisted on coming up here." Thomas looked me in the eye when we shook hands. "You've seen him," he said. "It wasn't a question. If you mean the wolf, then yes, not wolf. Amarok. And he is not happy with what men have been doing to his land." Jake looked uncomfortable. "Thomas, with all due respect, we're dealing with some kind of unusual predator behavior here. Maybe a hybrid or a wolf with gigantism, but—" "You think science has answers for everything," Thomas interrupted. "But some things are older than science." He turned back to me. "How many wolves have you put radio collars on in the last year?" The question caught me off guard. 12. We're tracking pack movement patterns. "And how many have you relocated when they caused problems?" 3 families. Standard wildlife management protocol. Thomas nodded grimly. "You break up families. You put metal around their necks. You decide where they can live. Then you wonder why Amarok comes." "I'm trying to protect them," I said, getting angry. "Human development is encroaching on their territory. Without management." "Without management, they lived here for 10,000 years, Thomas said. "With management, they die." Before I could respond, we heard it, the howl. But this time it was different. Not one voice, but many. A chorus of howls coming from all directions, getting closer. Jake went pale. "That's not possible. We flew over this area 2 hours ago. There were no wolf packs anywhere near here." "Look outside," Thomas said quietly. Through the window, we could see them. Wolves? Dozens of them, emerging from the tundra like they'd been invisible. They moved in perfect formation, all heading toward the cabin. But these weren't normal wolves. They were huge, all of them. Not as big as the one I'd seen on the hill, but much larger than any wild wolves should be. "They're not here to hurt us," Thomas said. "They're here for the ceremony." "What ceremony?" I asked. "The one where Amarok decides whether you deserve to stay on his land." The wolves arranged themselves in a huge circle around the cabin, just like the dead caribou had been arranged. They sat perfectly still, all facing inward, all watching us. Then, in the center of the circle, he appeared. Amarok was even larger than I remembered. Standing on his hind legs, he would have been 8 feet tall. His fur was silver gray, shot through with white that seemed to glow in the dim afternoon light. But it was his eyes that held me frozen. They were ancient, intelligent, and completely alien. He looked directly at me through the window, and I felt something I'd never experienced before. It was like he was looking into my mind, reading every thought, every memory, every decision I'd ever made about wildlife management. "He wants to talk to you," Thomas said. "Alone." "That's insane," Jake protested. "That thing will kill her." "If he wanted her dead, she would already be dead," Thomas replied. "This is about something else." I knew Thomas was right. I could feel it. Amarok wasn't here to hunt. He was here to judge. I walked to the door, my legs shaking. Every instinct screamed at me to stay inside, to hide, to run. But I knew running wouldn't help. Whatever this was, it had been building for 13 years of my career. Maybe longer. I opened the door and stepped outside. The cold hit me like a slap, but that wasn't what made me gasp. Up close, Amarok was even more impossible. He wasn't just large, he was wrong, in a way that my brain couldn't quite process. Too solid, too present, like he existed more than everything else around him. He stepped closer, and I could smell him. Not the musky scent of a normal wolf, but something older, like deep earth, like winter, like the first snow that ever fell. When he was close enough that I could see the individual hairs in his coat, he sat down. We were eye to eye now, and I realized he was waiting for something. I thought about my grandmother's stories, about the old agreements between people and the land. Slowly, carefully, I knelt in the snow. Amarok tilted his massive head, studying me. Then he did something that almost made me faint. He spoke, not with words, but directly into my mind. Images, feelings, memories that weren't mine flooded through my consciousness. I saw the land as it had been before humans. Before roads and research stations and radio collars, I felt the ancient rhythms of predator and prey, the balance that had existed for millennia. And I understood what I had done wrong. The visions Amarok shared weren't just images, they were emotions, sensations, the actual experience of being connected to something vast and wild. I felt what it was like to run across endless tundra, to be part of a pack that moved like a single organism, to hunt with instincts older than human civilization. But then the visions changed, became darker. I saw the first research teams arriving in the territory. I felt the confusion and fear of wolves when strange humans began following them, shooting them with tranquilizer darts, clamping metal collars around their necks. Through Amarok's consciousness, I experienced what it felt like to have your movements tracked and plotted, to have humans decide where your family could live, which territories were acceptable for your kind. I felt the desperation of pack leaders whose authority meant nothing when faced with human wildlife management. "We were trying to protect them," I whispered. Amarok's response came as a wave of ancient sadness mixed with anger. Protection that required control wasn't protection at all. It was domination wearing a kind mask. I saw myself through his eyes, all my years of research, all my careful studies and population surveys. To him, I was just another human who thought she knew better than 10,000 years of natural balance. But then something else came through the connection. Amarok showed me the other people who had encountered him over the decades. The ones who had learned to see the land differently, who had stopped trying to manage and started trying to understand. There was a choice to make. I could continue as I had been, studying and managing and controlling, or I could become something else, a guardian rather than a manager, someone who protected the old agreements instead of imposing new ones. "What happens to my work?" I asked. "My research?" The answer came not in words but in understanding. Real research meant learning from the land, not just studying it. True science required humility, not just knowledge. Amarok stood and walked toward the circle of normal wolves. They rose as he approached, still maintaining their perfect formation. I realized this was a test not just for me, but for my entire species. Humans had spread across the Arctic, bringing roads and settlements and research stations. We thought we were being responsible, managing the wildlife for their own good. We had forgotten that some things were older and wiser than we were. The great wolf turned back to me one last time. The message was clear: choose now. I thought about my career, my doctorate, my reputation in the scientific community. Everything I'd worked for was based on the idea that humans could and should manage wildlife populations, that we were smart enough, educated enough, to make decisions for entire ecosystems. But I also thought about my grandmother's stories, about people who lived on the land instead of trying to control it, about the possibility that 13 years of careful research might have been 13 years of missing the point entirely. I understand, I said. What happened next defied every law of physics I knew. Amarok began to change. His form became less solid, more like living smoke. The other wolves did the same, their bodies becoming translucent, ethereal, but I could still feel their presence, their ancient power. Amarok's voice filled my mind one last time, not with visions but with actual words. Prove it. Then they were gone. All of them. The circle of wolves simply faded away like morning mist, leaving nothing but tracks in the snow. I stood alone in the sudden silence, knowing my life had just changed forever. Jake and Thomas came out of the cabin cautiously, looking around at the empty landscape. "Where did they go?" Jake asked. "They're still here," I said, and somehow I knew it was true. They're always here, we just usually can't see them. Thomas nodded like he understood. "What will you do now?" I looked out across the tundra, seeing it differently than I had an hour ago. Not as a resource to be managed or a system to be studied, but as a living entity with its own intelligence and will. "I'm going to learn to listen," I said. The official report I filed about the incident was carefully worded. Wildlife mortality event resolved, probable cause. Natural predation, combined with seasonal stress factors. The radio collar malfunctions were attributed to equipment failure. The arranged caribou were described as an unusual but not unprecedented predator caching behavior. No one questioned my findings. After all, I was the expert. But my real work was just beginning. I started by removing every radio collar I'd placed over the years. It took weeks, tracking down the wolves and finding ways to safely remove the devices. Some of the animals seemed to know what I was doing. They would approach me without fear, standing perfectly still while I cut away the collars that had marked them as research subjects. I stopped the relocation programs. Instead of moving problem wolves, I worked with local communities to find ways for humans and wolves to coexist without human intervention. It wasn't easy, and it didn't always work. But it felt right, in a way my previous methods never had. The changes in myself were harder to document but impossible to ignore. I began to notice things I'd missed before, subtle signs of animal movement, weather patterns that weren't in any meteorological textbook, the way the land itself seemed to communicate through changes in wind and light. Most importantly, I could sense when Amarok was near. Not see him, he remained invisible unless he chose otherwise, but feel his presence like a change in air pressure before a storm. He was watching, judging whether I was keeping my promise to listen instead of control. 3 months after the encounter, I got a call from Sarah at Tulik Lake. Her voice was excited, confused. "Elena, something strange is happening with our wolf population data. The pack behaviors are changing. They're more organized somehow, more efficient. It's like they're coordinating across much larger territories than we thought possible." "Maybe they always did," I said. "Maybe we just weren't looking at it right. But the patterns don't match anything in the literature. It's like they're following some kind of guidance we can't detect." I knew what she meant, but I didn't say so. Some knowledge wasn't meant for scientific journals. My grandmother visited me that spring. She was frailer than I remembered, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. We walked across the tundra together, moving slowly to accommodate her age. "You look different," she said as we paused to rest on a hillside overlooking the valley where I'd first encountered Amarok. "I feel different." "Good." The land needs more people who understand their place in it. What was my place before? She smiled. You were trying to be the alpha of a pack that already had one. That evening, as my grandmother slept in the cabin, I heard the familiar howl echoing across the tundra. But this time I wasn't afraid. I walked outside and howled back, not with my voice, but with something deeper. A call that said, I understand, I'm listening, I'll do better. The response came not as sound but as feeling, approval, acceptance, and something else, a sense of ongoing responsibility. This wasn't a one-time agreement but a lifetime commitment. The work I do now doesn't look like traditional wildlife management. I spend more time with local communities, learning traditional knowledge that goes back generations. I study the land not as a system to be controlled, but as a teacher with lessons I'm only beginning to understand. The scientific community thinks I've gone soft, become too influenced by folklore and unscientific thinking. My papers are rejected more often than they're accepted. My funding has been cut twice. I don't care. Because I know something they don't. The wolves are still being managed, just not by us. There's an intelligence at work in the wilderness that's older and wiser than any human institution. Our job isn't to control it, but to learn from it, to find our place within it rather than above it. Sometimes, when I'm out on the tundra alone, I see him, Amarok. Just a glimpse, a shadow moving between the hills. He's watching, making sure I remember my promise, making sure the balance holds. And sometimes, on nights when the aurora is bright and the wind carries voices from the ancient world, I hear other stories. Tales of researchers in remote locations who've had encounters similar to mine. Scientists who've learned to listen instead of lecture. People who've discovered that the wilderness doesn't need our management, it needs our respect. The land is teaching us, one person at a time. The question is whether we're willing to learn before it's too late. My name is Elena Nighthawk, and I used to be a wildlife manager. Now I'm something else, a student, a guardian, a small part of something much larger than myself, and I've never been happier to not be in control. My name is Samuel Goldstream, and I've been a park ranger in Alaska for 20 years. Most folks think that means I sit around campfires telling bear stories, but the truth is different. I work the Yukon-Charlie Rivers National Preserve, and my job is keeping people alive when everything goes wrong. The radio crackled in my cabin that March morning in 1979. Static filled the air like angry wasps. I'd been monitoring emergency frequencies since dawn, watching the aurora forecast with growing worry. The northern lights were supposed to be spectacular that night, the kind that draws photographers from around the world and makes pilots nervous. Base station, this is Ranger Goldstream, I said into the microphone. Radio check, over. Nothing but white noise answered back. I'd seen this before. When the aurora gets strong enough, it messes with radio waves, something fierce. The electromagnetic storms up there can turn your best equipment into expensive paperweights. But this felt different. The static had a pattern to it, almost like voices whispering in a language I couldn't understand. My cabin sits on the Charlie River, about 150 miles from the nearest road. The only way in or out is by plane, and that's assuming the weather cooperates. On my desk, next to the radio equipment, sat a stack of reports that had been keeping me awake at night. 3 small aircraft had gone missing in the past week. All of them were last heard from during strong aurora displays. The first was a mail plane heading to Circle. The pilot, Jim Morrison, had been flying these routes for 15 years. He knew every mountain and valley like his own backyard. His last transmission came through garbled and strange. Something's wrong with my compass. The lights are moving wrong. They're not supposed to. Then silence. The second plane carried a geological survey team. 2 scientists and their pilot, Sarah Chen, vanished near the old mining claims up Woodchopper Creek. Sarah's final words still gave me chills. The aurora is below us now. That's impossible. It's underneath the plane. The third disappearance happened just 2 nights ago. A private pilot named Robert Hayes was flying his family back from Fairbanks when the lights started dancing. His wife managed to get one last transmission through before everything went quiet. Bobby's eyes are glowing green. The children are singing along with something we can't see. I pushed back from my desk and walked to the window. Outside, The March afternoon was already growing dark. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the winding silver ribbon of the Charlie River. Somewhere out there, those missing planes were waiting to be found. My radio equipment filled most of one wall of the cabin. 20 years of working search and rescue had taught me that communication could mean the difference between life and death. I had backup systems for my backup systems. But looking at the silent radios now, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Alaska cold. The old native stories came back to me. The ones the elders told about sky dancers who hunt during the northern lights. I'd always figured they were just trying to explain something they didn't understand. Aurora are caused by solar particles hitting our magnetic field. Simple science, but as the static whispered from my speakers, those old stories didn't seem so crazy anymore. I checked my weather instruments. The magnetic field readings were off the charts. According to my equipment, we were about to experience the strongest aurora activity in 50 years, the kind that could light up the sky like daylight and make compass needles spin like pinwheels. Outside my window, the first green glow was starting to appear on the northern horizon. The aurora came alive at sunset like nothing I'd ever seen. Green curtains of light stretched across the sky, dancing and twisting in patterns that made my eyes water. But there was something wrong about the way they moved. Aurora are supposed to follow the magnetic field lines, flowing in predictable arcs. These lights were moving like living things, reaching down toward the earth with finger-like tendrils. My radio suddenly burst to life with a transmission that made my blood freeze. "Mayday, Mayday, this is November 4, 7 Alpha." Came a voice I recognized as Jim Morrison, the missing male pilot. "I'm somewhere over the Charlie River." "But that's impossible. I've been missing for 6 days." I grabbed the microphone. "Jim, this is Samuel Goldstream at base station. What's your location? Are you injured?" Static filled the airwaves for several seconds. When Jim's voice came back, it sounded different, older, tired. "Samuel? Is that really you?" I can't find my way home. The lights won't let me land. Every time I try to descend, they pull me back up. I looked at my instruments. The readings made no sense. According to my equipment, the transmission was coming from directly overhead, but also from somewhere hundreds of miles away. The signal strength kept fluctuating, as if the source was moving impossibly fast. "Jim, I need you to describe what you see," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The aurora. It's not just lights anymore. There are shapes in it. People-shaped, but made of green and blue fire. They're hunting something." The radio went dead. I rushed outside and scanned the sky with binoculars. The aurora writhed above me like a living creature, but I couldn't see any aircraft. The lights were so bright they cast shadows on the ground, shadows that seemed to move independently of the aurora itself. That's when I heard the singing. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a haunting melody that made my teeth ache. The sound wasn't coming through the air, it was coming through my radio equipment, even though I'd left it inside. The aurora was somehow using my own electronics to broadcast directly into my cabin. I ran back inside to find all my radio dials spinning on their own. Voices and languages I'd never heard were mixing with the static. But underneath it all, I could make out familiar words spoken by familiar people. "Help me." Sarah Chen's voice, the missing geologist pilot. "We can't find our way home." Multiple voices now, including children. "The lights are hunting us." Robert Hayes, barely a whisper. Then, cutting through everything else, came a voice that wasn't human at all. It spoke in perfect English, but there was something wrong with the rhythm, like someone who had learned the language by listening to radio transmissions. "Samuel Goldstream, you coordinate the search frequencies. You will help us gather the lost ones." My hands shook as I reached for the microphone. "Who is this? What do you want with those people?" "We are the hunters between worlds. When the sky fires dance, we collect what has been separated from the earth. Your missing aircraft carry precious cargo, souls caught between life and death. You will guide them to us." The lights outside my window suddenly flared brighter, and I felt a strange pulling sensation, like invisible hands trying to drag me toward the door. My radio equipment began to smoke, and the smell of burning electronics filled the cabin. "I won't help you," I said into the microphone. "Those are innocent people." The voice laughed, a sound like aurora crackling. You already are helping, Samuel Goldstream. Your radio signals guide them to us. Every rescue frequency you broadcast leads them deeper into our realm. The electromagnetic pathways you create become bridges between worlds. I looked at my instruments in horror. The radio waves I'd been using to try to locate the missing aircraft. I'd been painting targets for these things. Every emergency broadcast had been leading the lost planes further into whatever dimension the Aurora hunters inhabited. The pulling sensation grew stronger. My feet began sliding across the floor toward the door, as if the Aurora outside was a massive magnet and I was made of iron. Through my windows, I could see the lights forming distinct shapes now, tall, shifting figures that beckoned with arms made of green fire. I grabbed onto my desk and held tight. The old mining equipment scattered around the preserve. Some of it was copper. If these things were electromagnetic in nature, maybe copper could interfere with their abilities. The miners used to string copper wire around their claims to mark boundaries. "Fight them, Samuel," came Jim Morrison's voice through the radio, clearer now. "Don't let them use you like they used us." We tried to resist, but the lights, they got into our instruments first, then into our heads. The Aurora hunter's voice returned, no longer trying to sound friendly. "You cannot resist the electromagnetic tide, Samuel Goldstream. Your metal equipment calls to us. Your electronic signals feed us. Soon you will dance between earth and sky, gathering the lost for our eternal hunt." I felt my grip on the desk weakening as the strange force pulled me toward the door. Outside, the Aurora figures were taking clearer shape, reaching down from the sky like massive hands made of colored light. That's when I remembered the old copper mine shaft about a quarter-mile from my cabin. I let go of the desk and let the electromagnetic force pull me outside, but at the last second I dove sideways toward my emergency supply shed instead of walking into the Aurora's reach. The lights above me flared angry red, and I heard that inhuman voice boom through the air itself. "You cannot hide from us, Samuel Goldstream. We are the space between radio waves. We live in the gaps between your transmissions." The shed contained my survival gear, including a portable radio and emergency flares. But more importantly, it held my collection of old mining artifacts I'd gathered over the years, including several yards of copper wire that prospectors had used to mark their claims. I grabbed the copper wire and quickly wrapped it around my wrists and ankles. The effect was immediate. The pulling sensation stopped, and the voices in my head faded to whispers. The Aurora hunters were electromagnetic beings, and copper was messing with their ability to control me. Through my radio, I heard Sarah Chen's voice again, but this time she sounded more alert. "Samuel, I can hear you thinking more clearly now. What did you just do?" "Copper wire," I gasped into the microphone. "I wrapped copper wire around myself. It's blocking their electromagnetic control." "We're trapped in some kind of pocket dimension," Sarah continued. "The Aurora creates doorways between worlds. These hunters use them to collect people who get lost during electromagnetic storms. But if copper works..." Jim Morrison's voice joined in. "There's an old mining claim up Woodchopper Creek. Lots of copper wire still strung around the site. If we could reach it." "The hunters won't let you," came a new voice, Robert Hayes. "They've been feeding off our life energy for days. We're getting weaker. My family," his voice broke. "My children are starting to glow like the lights." Outside, the Aurora hunters were taking more solid form. I could see them clearly now through my windows. Tall figures made of shifting green and blue light, with faces that looked almost human except for the eyes. Their eyes were black holes in the colored fire, and looking at them made my vision blur. One of the hunters pressed against my window, and the glass began to frost over, despite the electromagnetic barrier my copper wire created. When it spoke, its voice came through my radio and vibrated through the walls at the same time. "Copper slows us but does not stop us. We have hunted between worlds for centuries, Samuel Goldstream. Your metal barriers are temporary. Soon, your electromagnetic field will weaken, and we will add you to our collection." I had to reach the old mining site. If there was enough copper wire there to create a larger barrier, maybe I could protect the missing pilots long enough to figure out how to get them back to our dimension. But that meant leaving the relative safety of my cabin and traveling through miles of wilderness while Aurora hunters stalked me from above. I loaded my backpack with emergency supplies and all the copper wire I could carry. The old mining claim was 4 miles away through rough terrain, but I knew the path by heart. What worried me was what I'd encounter along the way. The moment I stepped outside, the aurora flared brighter. The hunters moved through the sky like sharks through water, circling overhead. But they kept their distance. The copper wire around my arms and legs created enough interference to make me harder to grab. As I hiked through the forest, my portable radio crackled with transmissions from the trapped pilots. "Samuel, they're following you," Jim warned. "I can see your electromagnetic signature moving through their realm. Be careful, they're driving other lost souls toward your position." He was right. As I moved deeper into the wilderness, I started encountering things that shouldn't exist. A caribou with aurora fire dancing between its antlers blocked my path, staring at me with those same black hole eyes. When I threw a rock at it, the creature dispersed into colored light, only to reform a few yards away. Worse were the human shapes I glimpsed between the trees. Prospectors from the gold rush era, their clothes rotted away but their bodies made of the same aurora fire as the hunters. They'd been collected decades ago, and now served as scouts for their captors. "Don't look directly at the ghost miners," Sarah's voice warned through my radio. "They're trying to drain your life force through eye contact. The hunters use them to weaken prey before the final collection." I pulled my hat low and focused on the path ahead. Every step was a struggle. The aurora overhead seemed to be pressing down on me like a heavy blanket, making it hard to breathe. My copper wire grew hot against my skin, working overtime to block the electromagnetic assault. Halfway to the mining claim, I heard children singing. The sound came from behind me, back toward my cabin. Robert Hayes's family was being used as bait. The aurora hunters had learned that I was trying to help the trapped pilots, so they were using my desire to rescue people against me. "It's a trap," Robert's voice came through my radio, weak and distant. "Don't come back for us. Get to the copper mine. Create a barrier big enough to protect all of us. Then figure out how to his transmission cut off." Through my radio came the sound of children crying, then silence. I was less than a mile from the old mining claim when the real attack began. The aurora hunters stopped playing games. All pretense of subtlety vanished as they descended from the sky like falling stars. The electromagnetic pressure became so intense that my portable radio started smoking. Even with copper wire protection, I could feel them trying to get inside my head. "Samuel Goldstream." Their collective voice boomed through the forest itself. "You will join the eternal hunt. Your electromagnetic knowledge makes you valuable. Surrender now, and your death will be brief. Resist, and we will feed on your terror for centuries." The trees around me began to glow with aurora light. The hunters were using the forest itself as a conductor, turning every pine needle and branch into an antenna for their electromagnetic assault. My copper wire was heating up to the point of burning my skin, but I didn't dare remove it. I could see the mining claim ahead. Old wooden structures and copper wire strung between posts like a giant spiderweb. If I could reach it, I might have enough conductive material to create a real barrier. But the hunters were descending faster now, and I could feel my protection weakening. That's when I remembered the emergency flares in my backpack. I pulled out 3 emergency flares and lit them all at once. The sudden burst of chemical fire disrupted the electromagnetic field around me, just long enough to break the hunters' focus. While they recoiled from the unexpected interference, I sprinted the final 100 yards to the mining claim. The old copper wire was still there, strung between wooden posts in a rough grid pattern. Decades of weather had turned it green with oxidation, but it was still conductive. I grabbed as much as I could and began wrapping it around the largest wooden structure, an old sluice house that looked sturdy enough to serve as a shelter. As I worked, my radio came back to life. The voices of the trapped pilots were clearer now, as if the copper barrier was somehow amplifying their signals. "Samuel, you need to understand what these things really are," Sarah's voice urged. "We've been talking while you hiked. Jim's been missing the longest. He's learned things." Jim's voice took over, sounding more tired than before. "The aurora hunters aren't just electromagnetic beings. They're souls like us, but from somewhere else. When people die during aurora storms, prospectors who froze to death under the northern lights, pilots who crashed during geomagnetic events, sometimes their spirits get caught between dimensions instead of moving on. The hunters were human once?" I asked, securing another section of copper wire. Human, but changed. Robert's voice joined in. They've been feeding on electromagnetic energy for so long they forgot what they used to be. The aurora storms open doorways between our world and theirs. They hunt people who get lost during second-timed electromagnetic events because we're like them, souls separated from our bodies. I understood now. The missing aircraft hadn't just disappeared into another dimension. During the intense aurora activity, the electromagnetic interference had somehow separated the pilots' souls from their physical bodies. They were trapped in the same space between worlds where the hunters lived. "How do I get you back?" I asked, working frantically as the aurora overhead grew brighter. "The copper creates interference, but it's not enough on its own," Sarah explained. "You need to reverse the electromagnetic process. Use your radio equipment to broadcast on the exact frequency that separated us. But it has to be from inside a Faraday cage, a complete electromagnetic barrier." I looked around the mining claim. The copper wire formed a partial grid, but it wasn't complete. I needed to create a fully enclosed space that would block all electromagnetic interference while simultaneously broadcasting a rescue signal. The aurora hunters seemed to realize what I was planning. Their assault intensified, and the copper wire began to vibrate like guitar strings. The metal was heating up rapidly, and I could smell insulation burning. "Samuel Goldstream," their voice boomed. "You cannot undo what we have done. The electromagnetic pathways between worlds are permanent. Your friends belong to us now." "Like hell they do," I muttered, connecting the final sections of copper wire to form a complete cage around the sluice house. The moment the circuit was complete, something amazing happened. The aurora overhead suddenly dimmed, as if the copper cage was drawing power away from it. My radio equipment, which had been sparking and smoking, suddenly cleared up completely. I could hear all the trapped pilots clearly now, but more importantly, I could hear their aircraft engines. They were trying to fly home, but the electromagnetic interference kept pulling them back into the hunter's dimension. "I'm going to try to guide you back," I told them. When I broadcast the return signal, focus on my voice and fly toward it. I set my radio to emergency frequency and began broadcasting a steady beacon signal. The copper cage amplified and focused the transmission, creating an electromagnetic lighthouse that cut through the aurora interference. Almost immediately, I heard the sound of aircraft engines getting closer, but the aurora hunters weren't giving up without a fight. The lights above me flared brighter than daylight. The copper wire began to glow red-hot. Even inside my Faraday cage, I could feel the electromagnetic pressure trying to crush me. The hunters were pouring all their collected energy into one final assault. "Samuel, something's happening," Jim's voice called through my radio. "I can see lights below us, real lights, not aurora. But the hunters are trying to drag us back." Through my radio, I could hear the sound of a W2, cosmic battle. The hunters were fighting to keep their prey, while the pilots struggled to break free from the electromagnetic web that held them. "Keep flying toward my signal," I shouted into the microphone. "Don't let them pull you back." That's when one of the aurora hunters made a crucial mistake. In desperation to stop the escaping aircraft, it descended too close to my copper cage. The electromagnetic interference disrupted its form, and for a moment I could see what it really was underneath the aurora fire. It was a human soul, twisted by decades of feeding on electromagnetic energy. Its face was gaunt and desperate, its eyes filled with hunger that had consumed its humanity. But in that brief moment of clarity, I saw something else: pain. These creatures were trapped, just like the missing pilots, caught between dimensions and unable to find peace. "You don't have to keep hunting," I called out to it. "You can let go. You can move on." The hunter recoiled as if I'd struck it. "We cannot. We have forgotten how to die properly. The electromagnetic hunger consumes all other thoughts." "Then, I'll help you remember," I said. I adjusted my radio to broadcast on multiple frequencies simultaneously. Not just the rescue beacon for the trapped pilots, but also a different kind of signal. A farewell transmission, the kind used to honor fallen aviators. The effect was immediate. The aurora hunters stopped their assault and began to change. The twisted hunger in their form started to fade, replaced by something that looked more human, more peaceful. One by one, they began to ascend toward the magnetic poles, their forms growing brighter and more transparent with each passing moment. They were finally able to let go, to move on to whatever comes after. The aurora display reached its peak just as the first aircraft broke through the dimensional barrier. Jim Morrison's mail plane materialized above my copper cage like a ghost becoming real. The aircraft looked exactly as it had 6 days ago, but Jim himself had aged years in the space between worlds. His hair was white now, and his eyes held the weight of someone who had seen beyond the normal boundaries of life and death. Sarah Chen's geological survey plane followed moments later, then Robert Hayes's family aircraft. All 3 pilots managed to land safely on the rough terrain near the mining claim, but their passengers were in shock. The children were singing songs in languages that didn't exist, and the survey scientists kept pointing at empty air as if they could still see the aurora hunters. "How long were we gone?" Sarah asked as she climbed out of her plane on shaking legs. 6 days for you and Jim, I told her. 2 days for Robert's family. It felt like months, Robert whispered, holding his wife and children close. Time doesn't work the same way in that place. We watched civilizations rise and fall in the space of heartbeats. The aurora hunters showed us the history of everyone they'd ever collected. The official reports called it an unprecedented geomagnetic storm that had caused temporary navigation failures and forced landings. The fact that 3 aircraft had been missing for days was attributed to faulty search procedures and communication equipment failures. But I knew the truth. The aurora hunters had been real, and they'd been collecting lost souls for over a century. The copper cage at the mining claim became my early warning system. Whenever electromagnetic readings spiked beyond normal levels, I'd hike out there and monitor the aurora activity. Over the years, I learned to predict when the dimensional barriers would weaken. I developed new emergency protocols for aviation during extreme aurora displays. Pilots were advised to carry copper wire in their emergency kits and to avoid flying during the strongest geomagnetic storms. Some of the old-timers thought I was crazy, but the younger rangers listened. We prevented dozens of disappearances by taking the aurora seriously as more than just a pretty light show. Jim Morrison retired from flying after his experience. He spent his remaining years documenting native stories about sky spirits and electromagnetic phenomena. Sarah Chen became a researcher studying the connection between geomagnetic events and reported supernatural encounters. Robert Hayes moved his family to somewhere with less spectacular northern lights. As for me, I developed a sensitivity to electromagnetic fields that let me predict aurora activity days in advance. Sometimes, on the clearest nights, I could still hear whispers in my radio static, not from hunters anymore, but from travelers who had found their way home to whatever lies beyond the lights. The mining claim is still there, copper wire gleaming in the moonlight. I check on it every few months, making sure the electromagnetic barrier remains strong. Because while I help the aurora hunters find peace, I know there are other things out there in the spaces between worlds, other entities that might not be as willing to let go. The northern lights are beautiful from a distance, but some dances are deadly. When the aurora reaches down toward the earth like grasping fingers, when your radio fills with voices speaking impossible languages, when your compass spins like it's forgotten which way is home, that's when you remember that some boundaries are there for a reason. And sometimes, late at night when the electromagnetic readings spike beyond normal levels, I still hear Jim Morrison's voice coming through my radio. "Samuel, the lights are moving wrong again. But now I know what to do about it." My name is Catherine Deepwater, and I've spent the last 15 years of my life studying frozen ground in places most people never see. I'm a park ranger with a PhD in geology, which sounds fancy, but really just means I know a lot about dirt and rocks and ice. For the past decade and a half, I've been working in Alaska's national parks, mostly alone, mostly in places where the nearest person might be 100 miles away. In July of 1989, I was stationed at Kobuk Valley National Park, specifically at the Great Kobuk Sand Dunes. People don't expect to find sand dunes in Alaska, but there they are, massive hills of sand sitting in the middle of the Arctic, like someone dropped a piece of the Sahara in the wrong place. Beneath those dunes lies permafrost, ground that's been frozen solid for thousands of years. I was there to do a geological survey. The Park Service was thinking about building some new infrastructure. Visitor centers, research stations, maybe even a small airstrip. My job was to figure out if the ground could handle it. Permafrost is tricky stuff. It looks solid, but when it thaws, it turns into soup. Buildings sink, roads buckle, and everything falls apart. The weather that July was warmer than usual. I could feel the ground getting soft under my boots in places where it should have stayed rock hard. My equipment, ground-penetrating radar, seismic sensors, core sampling tools, was picking up some odd readings, but nothing I couldn't explain. At first, I'd heard the local stories, of course. The Inupiaq people who lived in the area had legends about spirits that lived underground, beings they called those who sleep beneath. According to the elders, these spirits were the reason certain areas of land should never be disturbed. I respected their culture, but as a scientist, I figured these were just old explanations for natural phenomena. Ground that shifted mysteriously, probably seismic activity, strange sounds from underground, gas escaping through cracks in the permafrost. I was wrong about a lot of things. My base camp was a small weathered cabin about 5 miles from the main dune field. The Park Service had built it in the 1,960 seconds for researchers, and it showed its age. The radio worked when it felt like it, the generator coughed and wheezed, and the coffee maker only worked if you kicked it just right. But it was shelter, and in a place like this, shelter was everything. The first week went normally. I took core samples, ran radar scans, and set up a network of seismic sensors to monitor ground movement. The permafrost was definitely softer than it should be for the season, but that could be explained by the warm weather. My readings showed some unusual density variations underground, empty spaces where there should be solid earth, but caves and air pockets weren't unheard of in permafrost regions. It was on my 8th day that I first noticed something was really wrong. I was checking one of my seismic sensors, a device about the size of a lunchbox that I'd planted near the base of the largest dune. These sensors detect vibrations in the ground, earthquakes, rock slides, even heavy machinery from miles away. This one had been recording strange patterns for 2 days straight. The readout looked like a heartbeat, not the random tremors you'd expect from settling permafrost or distant earthquakes, but a steady, rhythmic pulse. Thump, pause, thump, pause. About 60 beats per minute, just like a resting human heart, but coming from deep underground. I checked the sensor, thinking it might be malfunctioning. Everything looked normal. I checked my other sensors. They were all picking up the same rhythm, though it was strongest at the dune site. Whatever was causing this pulse, it was big, and it was directly below the sand. That night, back at the cabin, I radioed my supervisor in Fairbanks. The connection was full of static, but I managed to explain what I'd found. Probably equipment interference, he said, his voice crackling through the speaker. Or maybe there's a natural gas pocket down there, releasing pressure in cycles. Document everything and keep monitoring. I wanted to believe him. Natural gas would explain the rhythmic pressure releases. But as I lay in my sleeping bag that night, listening to the wind howl across the dunes, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from underneath the ground. The next morning, I found tracks around my cabin. The tracks were unlike anything I'd seen in 15 years of wilderness work. They looked almost human, but wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. Each footprint was about the size of a man's boot, but deeper than any human foot should press into the semi-frozen ground. The toes were too long, spreading wide like someone walking barefoot, but with what looked like claw marks extending beyond where the toes should end. They circled my cabin 3 times, always staying about 20 feet away, like whoever made them had been pacing around the building in the dark. I followed the trail with my camera, taking pictures and measurements. The stride length was enormous, nearly 4 feet between steps. Either someone very tall had been walking around my cabin, or something had been taking impossibly long steps. The tracks led toward the dunes, then simply stopped at the base of the largest mound of sand, as if whoever made them had just sunk into the earth. My rational mind kicked in. Had to be a bear, I told myself. Black bears could leave tracks that might look humanish if the ground was soft. The claw marks supported that theory. But bears don't pace in perfect circles, and they definitely don't sink into permafrost. I spent that day expanding my sensor network, placing more seismic detectors in a wider pattern around the dunes. If something large was moving underground, I wanted to track it. The heartbeat rhythm continued, steady and strong, coming from what my equipment estimated to be about 50 feet below the surface. That afternoon, I made a discovery that changed everything. I was using my ground-penetrating radar to map what I thought might be a natural cave system when I found the entrance. It was hidden behind a collapse of sand and ice on the north side of the largest dune, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The opening descended at a steep angle, disappearing into darkness. My radar showed that this wasn't just a small cave. The tunnel system extended for miles in every direction, with chambers large enough to hold buildings. Some of the passages went deeper than my equipment could measure. I should have radioed for backup. I should have waited for more equipment, more people. Instead, I grabbed my headlamp, a rope, and my geological survey kit and squeezed through the opening. The tunnel was perfectly round, about 6 feet in diameter, with smooth walls that showed clear tool marks. Someone had carved this passage, and recently, the permafrost should have been too hard to work with hand tools, but the cuts in the walls looked fresh, with none of the ice buildup you'd expect in an old excavation. 20 feet down, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. I played my headlamp beam around the space and nearly dropped the light in shock. The walls were covered in carvings, not random scratches or natural erosion patterns, but deliberate artwork. Figures that looked almost human, but stretched and elongated, with arms that hung down to their ankles and faces that were just empty, dark hollows. The style was unlike any native Alaskan art I'd seen, more primitive, more ancient. At the center of each wall was a spiral pattern that seemed to draw the eye inward, making me dizzy if I looked at it too long. I took pictures, lots of them, though the camera flash made the carved figures seem to move in the strobing light. As I worked, I became aware of a sound that hadn't been there before. Or maybe I just hadn't noticed it. Breathing. Deep, slow breaths echoing from somewhere deeper in the cave system. Too deep and too slow to be human. Each inhale lasted about 10 seconds, each exhale the same. I realized I was listening to the source of the heartbeat my sensors had been detecting. Something down here was alive, and it was big enough that its breathing created seismic vibrations. I should have left then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of that cave and never come back. But I'm a scientist, and scientists need answers. I followed the sound deeper into the tunnel. The passage branched and split, creating a maze of interconnected chambers. My headlamp beam showed more carvings, stranger and more disturbing than the first ones. Scenes of the tall, thin figures emerging from underground, standing over much smaller human-like shapes. The smaller figures were always on their knees, arms raised as if in worship or surrender. The breathing got louder. I found myself in a chamber that was clearly not natural. The walls, floor, and ceiling were all perfectly smooth, carved from solid rock with precision that would challenge modern equipment. The room was circular, about 30 feet across, with tunnels leading off in 8 different directions like the spokes of a wheel. At the center of the room was a spiral pattern carved deep into the floor. The same design I'd seen on the walls, but much larger. As I approached it, my headlamp beam caught something that made me freeze. The spiral wasn't empty, something was moving inside it. I knelt down and aimed my light into the carved depression. The spiral went down at least 3 feet, carved in a continuous groove that wound tighter and tighter toward the center. And at the very center, coiled like a sleeping snake, was what looked like a massive root or vine. It was about as thick as my arm, pale gray in color, and it was definitely moving. Slowly, rhythmically, like something breathing. As I watched, the root thing uncoiled slightly and turned toward my light. At what I'd thought was one end, a horizontal slit opened up. Not a mouth exactly, but something like an eye. It was looking at me. I scrambled backwards so fast I fell over my own feet. My headlamp went flying, spinning across the floor and casting crazy shadows on the walls. In the spinning light, the carved figures seemed to be moving, reaching out from the walls with their impossibly long arms. I grabbed my light and ran. I didn't stop running until I was back in my cabin, with the door locked and every light in the place turned on. My hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the radio working. "Base, this is Catherine at Kobuk Valley," I said into the microphone. "I need to report a significant archaeological discovery. Requesting immediate backup and a full investigation team." Static answered me. I tried again, adjusting frequencies, checking connections. Nothing. The radio was working fine, but no one was answering. I was completely alone, 100 miles from the nearest human being, and something underground was starting to wake up. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that gray, root-like thing turning to look at me with its slit of an eye. I kept telling myself it had to be some kind of plant, maybe a rare fungus that had adapted to the permafrost environment. But plants don't look at you. Plants don't track your movement with the intelligence I'd seen in that underground chamber. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself that exhaustion and the strange environment had played tricks on my mind. Cave exploration can do that to people. The darkness, the isolation, the way sound echoes strangely off rock walls. I'd probably seen a normal root system, and my brain had filled in the rest. That theory lasted until I checked my seismic sensors. The steady, heartbeat rhythm had changed. Instead of the calm 60 beats per minute I'd been recording for days, the sensors now showed rapid, irregular pulses. Whatever was underground was agitated, its heart rate spiking like an animal that sensed danger. And it wasn't alone anymore. The sensors were picking up multiple sources now. The original signal was still the strongest, coming from deep beneath the main dune. But smaller rhythms had appeared all around the area. Dozens of them, scattered throughout the underground network. Each one had the same irregular, excited pattern. I spent the morning trying to reach someone, anyone, on the radio. I cycled through every frequency, sent out emergency signals, even tried to contact aircraft that might be passing overhead. The radio was working perfectly. I could hear static, even pick up some distant chatter between pilots, but no one responded to my calls. It was as if my voice couldn't get out, like some invisible barrier was keeping my transmissions from reaching the outside world. Around noon, I decided to pack up and leave. Whatever I'd found down in those tunnels was beyond my ability to handle alone. I could hike to the nearest village, bring back help, approach this thing properly with a full team and real equipment. I was loading my gear into my backpack when I heard the sound. It came from underground, muffled but clearly audible through the cabin floor. A low, rumbling moan that lasted about 30 seconds, followed by silence, then another moan from a different direction. Then another. Soon, the moans were coming from all around the cabin, a chorus of deep voices that seemed to be calling to each other through the earth. I grabbed my seismic readings and spread them out on the table. The multiple heartbeats I'd been tracking were all synchronized now, pulsing in unison like a single, massive organism, and they were moving. The sensors showed the sources of the rhythm slowly migrating upward, getting closer to the surface. Whatever lived in those deep chambers was rising, and they were doing it together, with purpose. I had to see what was happening at the dunes. I know how that sounds. Horror movies are full of people making stupid decisions, walking toward obvious danger instead of running away. But I'm a scientist, and sometimes the need to understand overrides common sense. I convinced myself that I just needed one more look. Enough information to make my eventual report useful. I hiked to the main dune with my backpack full of gear and my camera ready. The late afternoon sun was warm enough that the surface sand was actually hot under my boots, but the seismic activity had increased so much that I could feel vibrations through the ground with every step. The entrance to the cave system had changed. What had been a narrow squeeze between collapsed sand and ice was now a gaping hole about 10 feet wide. The opening looked like a mouth, with irregular edges, that reminded me uncomfortably of teeth. Warm air was flowing out of the tunnel, carrying a smell I couldn't identify, something organic and earthy, but wrong somehow, like soil that had been mixed with blood. I set up my equipment at what seemed like a safe distance and started taking readings. The ground-penetrating radar showed movement everywhere underground. Massive objects were shifting position in the deep chambers, and new tunnels were being carved at impossible speed. Whatever was down there was expanding its domain, creating new passages that spread out like a spiderweb beneath the entire dune field. That's when I saw the first one emerge. It crawled out of the tunnel opening like a massive gray worm, but as it reached the surface, it began to unfold. Arms and legs extended from what I'd thought was a segmented body. A head rose from the front end, turning left and right as if testing the air. It was one of the figures from the cave carvings, but real and alive. The creature stood about 8 feet tall, but was impossibly thin, like a human being that had been stretched on a rack. Its skin was the same pale gray color as the root thing I'd seen in the spiral carving, with a texture that looked more like stone than flesh. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in hands with fingers that were at least a foot long. The face was the worst part, just smooth gray skin with two dark holes where eyes should be and a horizontal slit for a mouth. It stood at the tunnel entrance for a long moment, that eyeless face turning in my direction. I was downwind and at least 200 yards away, hidden behind a smaller dune, but somehow I knew it was aware of me. The slit of its mouth opened and closed in what might have been breathing, or might have been tasting the air. Then it called to the others. The sound that came from the creature was like nothing I'd ever heard. Imagine the lowest note you've ever heard from a pipe organ, then lower it another octave and let it go on for a full minute. The call seemed to come from deep in the creature's chest, vibrating through the ground and into my bones. Similar calls answered from underground. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all with slightly different tones and pitches. The creature at the surface called again, and this time the sound was clearly communicative. It was talking to the others, telling them something about the surface world. More creatures began emerging from the tunnel. They came out one by one at first, then in groups of 3 or 4. Each one was slightly different, some taller, some with longer arms, some with additional joints in their limbs that let them bend in impossible ways. But they all had that same gray, stone-like skin and those empty eye sockets that somehow still seemed to see. Within an hour, there were at least 50 of them gathered around the tunnel entrance. They stood in a rough circle, their heads tilted upward toward the sun, mouths open as if they were feeding on the light. Some of them were making quiet sounds, not the deep calls but softer notes, almost like singing. I should have run then. I should have grabbed my gear and headed for the village as fast as my legs could carry me. But I was transfixed by what I was seeing. These creatures were clearly intelligent, possibly more intelligent than humans. The way they organized themselves, the complexity of their vocalizations, the obvious purpose in their movements, this was the discovery of a lifetime. I was so focused on watching them that I didn't notice the vibrations under my feet until it was too late. The sand beneath me began to sink, not collapsing like a normal dune, but descending smoothly as if it were being pulled down from below. I tried to scramble away, but the area of sinking sand was larger than I'd realized. Within seconds, I was waist-deep in sand that flowed like water, dragging me down toward a darkness that had opened beneath the dune. As I sank, I could see the gray creatures turning in my direction. Their empty eye sockets were all focused on me, and their horizontal mouths had opened wide, revealing rows of crystalline teeth that caught the sunlight like broken glass. They weren't just intelligent, they were hunters. And I had just fallen into their trap. The sand stopped flowing when I was buried up to my chest, leaving my arms free but my body completely trapped. I was in some kind of funnel-shaped pit, with smooth sides that offered no handhold for climbing. Above me, the circle of gray creatures had moved closer, standing at the rim of the pit and looking down at me with those terrible empty sockets. One of them, larger than the others, began to descend the side of the pit. It moved like a spider, its impossibly long fingers finding purchase on the smooth sand walls. As it got closer, I could see details that made my stomach turn. Its skin wasn't just gray, it was shot through with veins of what looked like mineral deposits, glowing faintly with their own light. The horizontal slit of its mouth was lined with those crystalline teeth, but behind them I could see another row of teeth, and another, going back into its throat like a shark's mouth. It stopped just a few feet above me and spoke. I don't know how I understood the words. The creature's mouth opened and closed, making sounds like grinding stone, but somehow the meaning appeared directly in my mind. The voice was ancient, tired, but absolutely commanding. "You have disturbed the deep places," it said without speaking. "You have brought tools of metal and noise where only silence should reign. Why do you poison the earth with your presence?" I tried to answer out loud, but my voice came out as a terrified whisper. "I'm a scientist. I was just studying the ground, checking if it was stable for construction. I didn't know anyone lived down there." The creature's head tilted to one side, considering my words. Around the rim of the pit, the others began making those low organ note sounds, but quieter now, like a conversation I couldn't understand. "You study the earth?" The large creature continued in my mind. "You know the stones and the deep cold, but you do not know the first truth of this place." "What truth?" "We are the earth. We are the bones beneath, the roots that hold, the breath that keeps the frozen ground from falling into the fire below. Your kind builds and digs and burns without knowing that we maintain the balance that keeps your world from breaking apart. As it spoke, images flashed through my mind, not words or pictures, but direct understanding. I saw the network of tunnels beneath the permafrost stretching across all of Alaska, all of northern Canada, even under the ice cap of the North Pole. In every tunnel system lived creatures like these, ancient beings that had been there since before human civilization began. They were caretakers of the permafrost, maintaining the delicate balance of ice and earth that kept the northern regions stable. When climate changes threatened to melt the frozen ground too quickly, they worked to reinforce it. When seismic activity threatened to crack the foundations of the continents, they absorbed the stress through their tunnel networks. But they were dying. Your kind releases poison into the air, the creature said. The deep cold that we tend grows weak. The earth bones crack and the foundation stones shift. We can no longer maintain the balance alone. I understood then why they had emerged. The permafrost really was becoming unstable, not just from the unusually warm weather, but from larger climate changes that were happening across the entire Arctic. These creatures were running out of time to find a solution. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "You understand the earth bones as we do. You know their weakness and their strength. We need your knowledge joined with ours, or all will fall into chaos." The creature extended one of its impossibly long arms toward me. Its fingers were tipped with claws that looked like they were made of the same crystalline material as its teeth, but it held its hand palm up in what was clearly an invitation, not a threat. "I can teach you the deep ways," it said. "Show you how the earth truly lives and breathes. But the learning requires trust. You must come below, into the heart chambers, where your body will change to match the deep places." I stared at its outstretched hand, understanding what it was offering. These creatures wanted to make me one of them, to transform me into something that could survive in their underground world and help them maintain the geological balance. I would gain knowledge that no human had ever possessed, become part of an ancient system that kept the world stable, but I would stop being human. And if I refuse, then you die here and we continue to fail. And eventually the northern earth collapses and takes your cities with it. But the choice is yours to make. Around the rim of the pit, more creatures had gathered. Hundreds of them now, all watching silently with their empty eye sockets. I could feel their patience, but also their desperation. They had been fighting a losing battle against climate change for decades, watching their ancient responsibility slip away as the world warmed beyond their ability to control. I thought about my life above ground. 15 years of working alone in remote places, studying problems that seemed to get worse every year. I had no family waiting for me, no close friends who would miss me if I disappeared. My official report on this site would recommend against any construction, which meant this area would remain protected whether I was here to monitor it or not. But more than that, I thought about what these creatures had shown me. The vast network of guardians working beneath the Earth's surface, maintaining a balance that most humans didn't even know existed. If they failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. Not just for the Arctic, but for the entire planet, as rising sea levels and geological instability triggered cascading environmental collapse. I reached out and took the creature's hand. Its skin was warm, despite looking like stone, and as our fingers touched, I felt a jolt of connection that went deeper than physical contact. Suddenly, I could sense the vast underground network, feel the subtle movements of earth and ice across thousands of square miles. The permafrost wasn't just frozen ground, it was a living system, breathing and shifting in patterns that these creatures had been tending for millennia. "It will not hurt," the creature said as it began to pull me up out of the sand trap. "The change comes slowly and brings understanding with each step." But as my feet came free from the sand, I felt the transformation beginning immediately. My skin tingled and began to toughen, taking on a grayish cast. My vision sharpened, showing me details in the underground darkness that human eyes could never see. Most strangely, I could suddenly sense the network of tunnels beneath my feet, feeling the movement of the other creatures like points of warmth in a vast three-dimensional map. The large creature led me toward the tunnel entrance, the others parting to make way for us. As we descended into the earth, I took one last look back at the surface world. The sun was setting over the sand dunes, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. It was beautiful. but I found that I no longer felt the loss of leaving it behind. Below ground, there were different kinds of beauty, and more important work to be done. The official report on the Kobuk Valley Geological Survey was filed 6 months later by a replacement ranger sent to investigate my disappearance. According to the documentation, Dr. Catherine Deepwater had vanished without a trace while conducting routine permafrost stability tests. Her equipment was found scattered around her base camp, and search teams discovered evidence of cave-ins near the main dune that suggested unstable ground conditions. The final recommendation was exactly what I would have written myself. The area was unsuitable for any kind of development and should remain permanently protected as undisturbed wilderness. What the report didn't mention was the strange seismic stability that had developed in the region following my disappearance. The permafrost, which had been showing signs of dangerous thawing, had somehow strengthened and stabilized. Ground temperatures had lowered by several degrees, and the underground structure was now more solid than it had been in decades. I know this because I'm still there. In a sense, the transformation took several weeks to complete. My body changed gradually, becoming something that could survive in the deep cold and high pressure of the underground chambers. My skin thickened and took on the gray, stone-like texture of the other guardians. My senses expanded to include perception of seismic vibrations, mineral compositions, and the subtle electrical fields that flow through the earth. But I kept my human mind, my scientific knowledge, and my understanding of the surface world. That was what they had needed from me, someone who could bridge the gap between their ancient wisdom and modern environmental science. Together, we worked to maintain the balance. I help them understand the chemical processes behind climate change, while they teach me techniques for geological stabilization that human science never discovered. We monitor the permafrost across thousands of square miles, strengthening weak points and redirecting thermal energy to prevent dangerous melting. It's important work, more important than anything I did as a surface-dwelling scientist. The network of underground guardians is all that stands between civilization and catastrophic geological collapse. Without our constant maintenance, the northern permafrost would destabilize completely within a few decades, releasing billions of tons of methane and carbon dioxide while triggering massive earthquakes and landslides. Sometimes I wonder what happened to my old life. Did anyone miss Dr. Catherine Deepwater? Did my disappearance make any difference to the world above? But those questions seem less important now. I have a new purpose, a new community, and knowledge that spans geological ages. The other guardians have accepted me fully. I communicate with them through the same vibration-based language they've always used, though I still think in English most of the time. They've taught me to read the deep history of the Earth, to understand the planet as a living system with its own intelligence and needs. We are not the only guardians. Similar communities exist beneath every major geological formation on Earth, under mountains, beneath ocean floors, in the deep places where tectonic plates meet. We're all connected through the rock itself, sharing information about seismic stress, mineral flows, and the planet's overall health. Humanity has no idea that this network exists, that their civilization depends on the constant work of beings they would dismiss as impossible. Occasionally, we encounter other humans who stumble into our domain. Scientists, mostly, or explorers who dig too deep in the wrong places. Most of them react with fear and have to be redirected. Their memories altered to forget what they've seen. But a few, like me, have the right combination of knowledge and willingness to join us. The network is always growing, because the threats to geological stability are increasing. Climate change is accelerating, and human industrial activity puts more stress on the planet's foundation systems every year. We need more guardians, more minds that can understand both the ancient ways and the modern challenges. If you're reading this somehow, if this account has reached the surface world through channels I can't imagine, then perhaps you're someone who might understand. Perhaps you're a scientist who's noticed unexplained seismic patterns, or a geologist who's found evidence of impossible underground structures. If you are, then know this: the Earth is alive, and it needs protection. The guardians beneath the permafrost are just one small part of a vast system that maintains the balance necessary for life on the surface. That system is under threat, and it needs help from minds that can bridge the gap between ancient wisdom and modern knowledge. Sometimes, Late at night in the deep chambers, I think about the sun setting over the sand dunes and wonder if I made the right choice. But then I feel the pulse of the Earth's heartbeat through the rock walls, sense the vast network of tunnels and chambers that stretch beneath entire continents, and I know that this is where I belong. The Guardians have work to do, and now, so do I. My name was Catherine Deepwater, and I was a park ranger who studied frozen ground in Alaska. Now I am something else, something more, and the Earth itself is my responsibility. The permafrost is stable, the deep places are secure, and the balance continues. But it won't continue forever without help. The choice is always there, for those who have the knowledge to understand and the courage to accept transformation. The Earth is calling, and it needs guardians now more than ever. Are you listening? My name is Robert Icebreaker, and I've been a park ranger at Glacier Bay for 22 years. People always laugh at my last name when they hear what I do for work, but it's real. My Tlingit grandfather gave it to our family long before I knew I'd spend my life around ice. I'm 52 now, and I've seen things in these glaciers that would make most people pack up and leave Alaska forever. But back in August of 1995, I thought I understood ice. I thought glaciers were just frozen water, nothing more. I was wrong about that, dead wrong. That summer was different from the start. The weather was too warm, even for August. The Johns Hopkins Glacier, where I spent most of my time, was calving faster than I'd ever seen. Huge chunks of ice, some as big as houses, were breaking off and crashing into the water every few hours. The sound was like thunder that never stopped. I'd been out there for 3 days straight, taking measurements and photos. The glacier was retreating so fast that headquarters wanted daily reports. Climate change was the official explanation, but something felt off about the whole thing. The ice wasn't just melting, it was almost like it was shedding. My boat, the Times Northern Light *, was anchored in the deep water about a quarter-mile from the glacier face. I had my instruments spread across the deck. Ice core drills, temperature sensors, cameras with telephoto lenses, everything I needed to document what was happening. The nearest town was 75 miles away, and radio contact was spotty because of all the ice. When you're out there, you're really alone. Just you, the glacier, and the deep, cold water that would kill you in minutes if you fell in. I remember the exact moment things started getting strange. It was around 3 in the afternoon, and I was photographing a fresh calving event. A section of ice about 50 feet wide had just crashed into the water, sending waves that rocked my boat. But as the ice settled and the water calmed down, I noticed something dark embedded in one of the smaller pieces. At first, I thought it was just dirt or rock. Glaciers pick up all kinds of debris as they move. But when I pulled the ice chunk closer with my boat hook and looked through my binoculars, my stomach dropped. It was an animal. Something that looked like a small deer, but perfectly preserved in the ice. Not just preserved, it looked fresh, like it had died yesterday and someone had stuffed it into a freezer. But this ice had to be hundreds of years old, maybe thousands. I'd found plenty of things in glacier ice before, ancient plants, bugs, even the occasional mammoth bone up north. But this was different. The animal's eyes were still clear, its fur still had color, and strangest of all, its mouth was open like it had been trying to breathe when it got frozen. I managed to haul the ice chunk onto my boat and chip the animal free. It was about the size of a small dog, with features I'd never seen before. The legs were too long, the ears too pointed. It didn't look like any species I knew, living or extinct. But when I touched it, the thing's skin was still soft. Not frozen solid like it should have been, not rotted like something dead for centuries, just soft, warm, even. That's when I heard my grandfather's voice in my head, telling me stories I hadn't thought about in decades. Stories about the ice having memory, about glaciers holding on to things from different times, keeping them safe, until the right moment to let them go. Just old legends, I said out loud to myself. My voice sounded small against the massive ice wall looming over me. But as I looked at the impossible animal in my hands, and then at the glacier that had held it for who knows how long, I started to wonder if maybe my grandfather hadn't been telling stories after all. Maybe he'd been trying to warn me. The next morning, I radioed headquarters about the animal. I kept the description vague, just said I'd found some unusual biological material and needed to speak with someone from the research division. The radio crackled with static, making the conversation choppy, but I managed to get through that. I was extending my survey for a few more days. I spent the morning examining the creature more closely. Under my magnifying glass, I could see details that made my hands shake. Its teeth were sharp and needle-like, designed for tearing meat, but its eyes were too intelligent for a simple predator. They were golden with flecks of ice blue, and even though it was dead, they seemed to track my movements. The strangest part was its fur. When I pulled out individual hairs to examine them, they felt warm between my fingers. Not just unfrozen, actually warm, like the animal had just been running around in summer sun instead of locked in ice for centuries. I was so focused on the creature that I almost missed the second calving event. The crash of ice hitting water jolted me back to reality, and I looked up to see another massive section of the glacier sliding into the fjord. The waves rocked my boat hard enough to knock my coffee mug off the console. But this time, I was watching when it happened. And I saw something that made me grab my camera with shaking hands. Just before the ice broke away, I swear I saw movement inside it. Not just cracks forming or ice shifting, actual movement. Like something was swimming through the solid ice, trying to get out. The binoculars confirmed what I hoped I hadn't seen. There were shapes in the newly exposed ice face. Dark shadows that looked almost human, trapped in the glacier like insects in amber. But these shapes were moving, reaching toward the surface, their mouths open in silent screams. I took pictures until my camera battery died, then switched to my backup. The images showed the shapes clearly, but they also showed something else that made my blood run cold. The ice around the figures was cloudy and swirled, like it was still liquid, like the glacier was digesting them. That afternoon, I decided to get closer to the glacier face than safety protocols recommended. I needed to see those shapes up close. Needed to prove to myself that my eyes were playing tricks. The water near the glacier was full of floating ice chunks, some small as basketballs, others big as cars. I navigated carefully between them, the boat's engine puttering quietly in the cold air. The glacier face rose above me like a frozen mountain, blue-white and ancient. I was maybe 100 feet away when I heard it, a sound I'll never forget as long as I live. It was singing. Not human singing, but something older. A low, wordless melody that seemed to come from inside the ice itself. The tune was beautiful and terrible at the same time, like a lullaby for the dead. It made my teeth ache and my eyes water, but I couldn't stop listening. The singing got louder as I got closer to the glacier. I could feel it in my chest, vibrating through the boat's hull and up through my bones. And as it played, the shapes in the ice began to move more frantically, pressing against their frozen prison like they were trying to escape. That's when I realized the singing wasn't random. It was a pattern, repeating every few minutes. And each time it repeated, more shapes appeared in the ice. Fresh ones, different from the others. Like the glacier was calling to them, gathering them from somewhere else. I was so mesmerized by the singing that I didn't notice the ice chunk floating toward my boat until it bumped against the hull. This one was smaller than the others, about the size of a washing machine, but it was perfectly clear. And inside it, looking right at me with wide, terrified eyes, was a man. He was wearing modern clothes, jeans, a flannel shirt, hiking boots. His hair was brown and messy, like he'd been running. His hands were pressed against the ice from the inside, and his mouth was open like he was shouting something I couldn't hear. But the worst part was his eyes. They were alive, aware, blinking. He was still conscious in there. I grabbed my boat hook and tried to break the ice around him, but it was hard as stone. The man inside saw what I was doing and started pounding on the ice with his fists. I could see his lips moving, forming words. "Help me, please help me." I swung the boat hook harder, putting all my strength behind it. The metal tip barely scratched the surface. The ice wasn't just frozen water, it was something else, something that didn't want to break. The man's eyes met mine, and I saw him mouth one more word before the ice chunk suddenly sank beneath the surface. "Run." I watched the clear ice disappear into the dark water, taking the trapped man with it. The singing from the glacier grew louder, more urgent, like it was celebrating. That's when I finally understood what my grandfather had been trying to tell me all those years ago. The glacier didn't just preserve things, it collected them. and now it was collecting me. I should have left right then. Should have pulled anchor and raced back to Bartlett Cove as fast as my boat could carry me, but I couldn't get that man's face out of my head. Those blinking eyes, the desperate way he'd mouthed, "Help me" through the ice. Instead, I did something stupid. I stayed. That night, anchored in the deep water with the glacier looming over me like a frozen mountain, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. I spread my photos across the boat's small cabin table and studied them under the lamp. In the harsh light, the shapes in the ice looked even more disturbing. They weren't just random figures, they were arranged in patterns, like the glacier was organizing them somehow. Some of the shapes were clearly human, dressed in clothes from different time periods. I could make out what looked like old-fashioned coats, maybe from the 1800s, and others in more modern clothing. But there were other things too. Animals I didn't recognize, twisted shapes that might have been human once but weren't anymore. Around midnight, the singing started again. This time, it was different, stronger. The melody seemed to wrap around my boat like invisible hands, and I could feel it pulling at something deep in my chest. My grandfather had taught me songs when I was little, traditional Tlingit songs about respect for the ice and the spirits that lived in it. But this song was older than anything he'd ever sung, older than human memory. I stepped out of the cabin to listen better, and that's when I saw them. The shapes in the glacier face were moving again, but now they were moving together, like they were dancing to the song. Their arms waved in slow motion through the ice, and their heads turned to look at me, all of them. Dozens of trapped figures, all staring directly at my boat. The singing grew louder, and I felt my feet moving without my permission. One step toward the boat's edge, then another. The melody was so beautiful, so welcoming. All I had to do was slip into the water and swim toward the glacier. The ice would welcome me, keep me safe forever. I was halfway over the rail when years of Coast Guard training kicked in. I grabbed the boat's horn and blasted it as loud as I could. The harsh sound shattered the melody like breaking glass, and suddenly, I was myself again, gasping and shaking on the deck. But the glacier wasn't done with me. As I watched, the ice face began to change. Cracks appeared in perfect geometric patterns, spreading across the surface like a giant spider web. The trapped figures pressed closer to these new weak points, and I could hear them now, muffled voices calling from inside the ice. Some were speaking English, others languages I didn't recognize. But they were all saying the same thing: "Join us, it's warm in here. Safe." The cracks spread faster, and chunks of ice began falling into the water. But these weren't random calvings. The glacier was deliberately releasing things. Ancient things that had been locked away for good reason. The first one to break free was a wolf. But it wasn't like any wolf I'd ever seen. It was huge, the size of a small horse, with fur that looked like it was made of frost. Its eyes glowed pale blue in the darkness, and when it hit the water, it didn't sink. It walked across the surface like it was solid ground. More animals followed, things that might have been bears once, but were wrong somehow. Too many teeth, joints that bent the wrong way, claws like icicles. They all walked on water, moving toward my boat with purpose. I started the engine and tried to back away, but the boat wouldn't respond. Looking over the side, I could see thick tendrils of ice growing up from the deep water, wrapping around my propeller and hull. The glacier wasn't just releasing its prisoners, it was making sure I couldn't escape. The ice wolf reached my boat first. It looked up at me with those glowing eyes and spoke in a voice like winter wind. "Robert Icebreaker, grandson of old Thomas, the ice has been waiting for you." It knew my name. It knew my grandfather. "Thomas promised," the wolf continued, patting around my boat on the frozen water. "Promised his bloodline would serve when the time came. The ice remembers promises, Robert. The ice remembers everything." More creatures were climbing onto the frozen water now. Things that had once been human, their skin blue-white and crackling with frost. They surrounded my boat, all watching me with the same pale, hungry eyes. "The warm times are coming," said a woman who might have been beautiful once, before the ice claimed her. "The glacier is dying. All the memories it holds, all the secrets it keeps, they will be lost unless someone helps us save them. We need a keeper," added a man whose beard was solid ice. "Someone to remember for us. Someone to hold our stories when the ice melts away." The singing started again, softer now, but more insistent. The melody wrapped around my thoughts like fog, making it hard to think clearly. The creatures on the water began to dance, slow and graceful, their movements hypnotic. "Just step down," whispered the ice wolf. "Into the water. It won't hurt. The ice will hold you, keep you, make you part of the memory forever." I looked at the dark water around my boat, now solid enough to walk on. It would be so easy. One step, and all this confusion would end. I would understand everything, be part of something ancient and important. My foot was touching the rail when I heard another voice, faint but familiar. My grandfather's voice, singing one of his old songs. Not the glacier's hypnotic melody, but something else. A protection song, a song for keeping bad spirits away. The ice creatures hissed and stepped back as I began to sing along. The words came, back to me from childhood, and with them came clarity. These things weren't trying to save the glacier's memories, they were trying to make me part of them. Another prisoner in the ice, another voice calling for help that would never come. But as I sang louder, the ice around my boat began to crack. The glacier's prisoners were retreating, but I could hear something else now. A deep rumbling from inside the glacier itself, like something enormous was waking up. The glacier had been patient with me, trying to lure me gently into its trap, but now it was getting angry. The rumbling grew louder, and the entire glacier face began to shake. Not the normal movement of ice settling, but something deliberate and alive. Cracks spread across the surface, in patterns that looked almost like writing, like the glacier was trying to speak in its own ancient language. The ice creatures around my boat backed away further, their glowing eyes wide with what might have been fear. Even they were afraid of what was coming. "You've made it angry?" whispered the ice wolf, its voice barely audible over the growing rumble. "The old one doesn't like to be refused." "Old one?" I managed to ask, still singing my grandfather's protection song under my breath. "The glacier itself," said the frost woman. "We are just its memories, its dreams, but it is the dreamer." The glacier face split open like a massive mouth, revealing a cavern of blue-black ice that seemed to go on forever. And from that cavern came a voice that made the singing from before sound like a whisper. It spoke in words older than any human language, but somehow I understood every syllable. "Robert Icebreaker, grandson of Thomas Whospe Akstoice. You carry his blood and his promise." The voice was everywhere at once, coming from the ice, the water, the air itself. It pressed against my mind like a physical weight, trying to crush my thoughts into submission. "I don't know what promise you're talking about," I shouted back, though my voice sounded tiny against the glacier's roar. "Your grandfather came to me in the great melting, when the warm winds first began to take my edges. He promised that his line would serve, would help me preserve what must not be lost." Images flooded my mind, memories that weren't mine. I saw my grandfather as a young man, standing on ice that looked different from the glacier I knew. Thicker, older, stretching further into the bay. He was speaking with something I couldn't see, making some kind of agreement. "The warm times grow stronger," the glacier continued. "Every year, I lose more of myself to the hungry waters. But I have collected so much, preserved so many moments. If I melt completely, all of time's memories will be lost." "Then, don't melt," I yelled back. "Fight the warming." The glacier's laughter was like the sound of a mountain falling down. "I am not fighting the warming, child. I am the warming. I have been, consuming time itself for thousands of years, growing larger, growing hungrier. But now the earth fights back, trying to digest me as I have digested so much else." The terrible truth hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just climate change. The glacier was some kind of temporal parasite, feeding on moments stolen from history, and as it grew stronger, it made the whole planet warmer, forcing the very ice that sustained it to melt. "I need a vessel," the voice boomed. "Someone to carry my memories when this body dies. Your grandfather promised his bloodline would provide one when the time came." "My grandfather was just a man," I said. But even as I spoke, I remembered things. Times when he would disappear for days, coming back with stories about the ice spirits. Times when he would touch me and I would see flashes of other places. Other times. His blood wasn't entirely human. He was more than man, as are you. The ice recognizes its own. The glacier began to move toward me. the massive ice face sliding forward on the water like a frozen tsunami. The creatures that had surrounded my boat were pulled back into the ice, their screams cutting off as they were absorbed into the glacier's growing mass. "I won't let you take me," I said, starting up my boat's engine. But the ice tendrils held me fast, and the propeller just churned uselessly against them. "You cannot refuse what is already yours by right. Feel the ice in your blood. Taste the cold that lives in your bones." And I could feel it, a coldness that had always been part of me, kept dormant until now. My grandfather's heritage, whatever he really was. The temperature around me began to drop, and frost started forming on my hands and face. But instead of fighting it, I embraced it. Let the cold flow through me completely. If I had ice in my blood, then maybe I could speak to this thing in its own language. I reached deep into my memory, calling up every story my grandfather had ever told me, every traditional song he'd taught me, but I didn't sing them the way he had. I sang them with the cold in my voice, with authority I hadn't known I possessed. The glacier stopped moving toward me. "You would challenge me?" It rumbled, but there was uncertainty in its voice now. "I would negotiate," I said, my breath now forming clouds in the suddenly Arctic air. My grandfather made a promise, but he made it as an equal, didn't he? Not as a servant. The silence stretched between us like the moment before ice breaks under pressure. "Speak your terms. GRANDSONOFICE. You want your memories preserved," I said. "I can help with that, but not by becoming your prisoner. I'll document everything, share your story with the world. Make people understand what's really happening to the climate, but in return, you stop taking people. Stop trying to consume time. Let the world heal. And when I melt, when all my memories are lost forever, then you'll be remembered in the stories I tell, in the records I keep." Memory doesn't have to be ice, it can be words, pictures, understanding. The glacier was quiet for a long time, considering. Around me, the ice tendrils holding my boat began to loosen. "This is acceptable," it finally said. "But know this, Robert Icebreaker. You are now the keeper of the deep cold. The glacier's memories will live in you, and when your time comes to die, you must find another to carry them forward." "I understand," I said, though I wasn't sure I really did. The glacier began to retreat, pulling back to its original position. But as it moved, it left something behind. A small piece of pure, clear ice floating next to my boat. Inside it, I could see swirling patterns of light and shadow concentrated memories, waiting to be understood. I pulled the ice aboard and felt the glacier's ancient knowledge flow into me. Thousands of years of preserved moments, all the history it had stolen and stored. It would take me the rest of my life to sort through it all, to understand what I now carried. But I had made a promise, and ice remembers everything. That was 30 years ago. I'm 82 now, retired from the Park Service, but still living in Alaska, still keeping my promise. The official reports from that summer mention unusual calving events and some interesting biological specimens found in the ice. Nothing about glacial consciousness or temporal parasites. I learned early on that some truths are too big for paperwork. But I've spent every year since then documenting what the glacier showed me. The memories it carried, the moments it had stolen from history. I've filled thousands of pages with observations, photographs, temperature readings, behavioral patterns. Most people think I'm just a dedicated climate researcher with an unusual interest in glacial mythology. They're not wrong, exactly. The Johns Hopkins Glacier is still retreating, still melting. But it's different now, slower, more natural. The desperate hunger I felt from it that August is gone, replaced by something that feels almost like peace. It's dying the way glaciers are supposed to die, gradually, gracefully, returning its water to the sea. But the memories it gave me are still here, still demanding attention. I've started giving talks at schools and universities, sharing what I learned about climate change and glacial behavior. I never mention the supernatural elements directly, but I make sure people understand that ice has a kind of memory, that glaciers preserve more than just old air and ancient snowfall. They preserve time itself. Sometimes, late at night when I'm reviewing my notes, I can still hear the glacier's voice, quieter now, more distant, but still there. It's teaching me things about the deep past, about patterns in the climate that go back further than human records. And sometimes I catch glimpses of the ice creatures in my peripheral vision, the glacier's former prisoners. They're free now, I think, but they still watch over the memories they once protected. Making sure I don't forget my responsibilities, I've been training my granddaughter, Sarah, to continue the work when I'm gone. She has the blood too. I can see it in the way frost never quite forms on her skin when she handles ice samples, the way glacial runoff seems to warm when she touches it. She thinks it's just genetics, a family trait that makes us well-suited for cold weather research. I haven't told her the whole truth yet, but soon I'll have to. The memories are too much for one person to carry forever, and the glacier's consciousness is still out there somewhere, still needing a keeper. Last month, I got a call from a park ranger in Denali. Strange calving events, he said. Objects found in the ice that shouldn't be there. Animals preserved in impossible detail, showing no signs of decay despite being frozen for centuries. I told him I'd look into it, because ice remembers everything, and some memories need witnesses. Some stories demand to be told, even if people aren't ready to believe them. The glaciers are melting faster every year now, all across Alaska. And as they retreat, they're releasing things that have been locked away since the last ice age. Most of it is harmless, ancient plants, old bones, traces of civilizations that lived and died before recorded history. But not all of it. There are other glaciers like Johns Hopkins out there. Other collectors of stolen time, other guardians of impossible memories. And as the world gets warmer, they're all going to need new keepers. People who understand that ice is more than frozen water. People who can hear the songs that glaciers sing and know how to sing back. People like my granddaughter. Though she doesn't know it yet, I'm working on a book about my experiences, carefully edited, of course, to focus on the scientific observations rather than the supernatural encounters. But between the lines, for those who know how to look, the real story is there. The truth about what lives in the ice, and what it means for all of us as the world continues to warm. Because the glacier was right about one thing: memory matters. And when the ice is gone, when all the ancient glaciers have melted into the rising seas, we'll need other ways to preserve the deep cold that once covered our world. We'll need stories, we'll need witnesses, we'll need people willing to carry the weight of impossible truths. The ice remembers everything. But ice doesn't last forever. That's what makes the memory so precious.